In a culture that keeps confusing volume with value, Kendrick Lamar and Drake are once again being dragged onto the same scale. And this time, the question on the table is the one that actually matters when you strip away the streams, the chart positions, the shoe deals, the legal filings, and every other surface metric. Who is actually the better writer? And before we step deeper into this, you need to understand something, because the internet has spent the last 72 hours pretending this is some impossible riddle that requires a panel of 20 randos and a debate stage, when in reality, the answer is sitting right inside the bars themselves, completely undisturbed, waiting for anybody honest enough to actually listen with both ears open. This question is not a vibe, it is not a feeling, it is not a brand loyalty contest, and that is exactly why everyone with skin in the game is so desperate to keep dragging the conversation away from the page. Because the moment you put the page on the desk, the noise stops and the receipts speak. And before we get any further into this, do me a favor, because the algorithm is doing what the algorithm always does the second this kind of conversation starts moving. It slows down our reach on the bigger commentary channels and pushes the rage bait clips instead. The only thing that breaks that ceiling is engagement, so if you have made it this far, hit the like, hit the subscribe, drop a comment with your honest verdict, and let us keep this conversation in front of the people who actually care about the craft. Now, with all of that on the table, let us actually do the work, because this question deserves a forensic answer, not a popularity poll. Here is the trap that everyone keeps falling into. When this debate gets brought up, somebody almost always pivots to streams, somebody pivots to influence, somebody pivots to generational impact, and somebody pivots to storytelling versus rapping. And every single one of those pivots is a smokescreen. Because writing, actual writing, the mechanical, measurable craft of putting syllables together in service of meaning, has its own rulebook, and that rulebook is older than either of these men. Writing in rap is judged by literary mechanics. It is judged by multi-syllabic rhyme construction, by internal rhyme, by alliteration, by assonance, by consonance, by punchline architecture, by metaphor density, by storytelling cohesion, by pocket and cadence, by how much information you can compress into a single bar without losing the rhythm. Naturally, none of that fits in a tweet, which is why nobody on social media wants to have the conversation honestly. But we are going to have it honestly, right now, today. Pull up any a cappella verse Drake has ever spit. Pull up the radio freestyle where he reaches for Slumdog Millionaire and Bollywood flow. Listen to it with a clean ear. What you actually hear when the beat is gone and the production cannot carry the weight is a writer who is comfortable with single-syllable end rhymes. You hear views rhyming with crews, rhyming with shoes, rhyming with dudes. You hear the line, we walk the same path but got on different shoes, live in the same building but we got different views. There's nothing technically wrong with that line. It's clean, it's conversational, it's radio-friendly. But it is also one of the most foundational, lowest difficulty rhyme structures in the entire rap toolbox. It's the kind of rhyme a competent 15-year-old could write on a school bus. And the reason this matters is not because we're trying to drag Drake, it's because writing is graded on a curve, and that curve has a top, and we need to know how high the top is before we can place anybody on it. Now, flip the tape. Pull up Kendrick Lamar's radio freestyle, the one where he opens with the conversation between his father and his uncle Tony at the domino table. Listen to what happens in the first 8 bars. Tony had told him that he saw a young brother hopping out bustin' like 4 charters, popping pills, mixing a gallon of Sherm and some holy water. Pause right there. Inside one breath, Kendrick Lamar has set the scene, introduced 2 characters, delivered a multi-syllabic punchline, hopping out bustin' like 4 charters, and embedded an internal rhyme structure that runs 3 deep. And he's just warming up. That opening alone carries more literary information than entire verses on radio rotation right now, and he drops it like it costs him nothing. 2 bars later, Kendrick Lamar delivers what is, technically speaking, a masterclass in compressed literary craft. Vivid images going against any fantasy you can fathom. Phantoms ain't the only things that's suicidal. Read that out loud, slowly. What you have just heard is a quadruple-stacked literary device. Alliteration on the fricatives, fantasy, fathom, phantoms, assonance, bridging fantasy and phantom, internal rhyme, bridging fathom and phantom, and a metaphorical pivot from the physical, vivid imagery, to the spectral, phantoms, to the psychological, suicidal.
4 moves, 12 words, 1 breath. That is not a vibe, that is not a feeling, that is not a brand loyalty contest, and that is exactly why everyone with skin in the game is so desperate to keep dragging the conversation away from the page, because the moment you put the page on the desk, the noise stops and the receipts speak. And before we get any further into this, stack the receipts. Kendrick Lamar's very next bar gives you rifle aimed at your arteries, part of me, parts of me is psycho. Listen for the rhyme scheme. Rifle, aimed, arteries, parts, psycho. That's an ABBA internal pattern with alliteration on the hard A and hard P consonants running concurrent. Try writing that. Try sitting down at a desk, sober, with a notepad, and constructing 4 bars that carry that level of phonetic interlock while also advancing a coherent narrative about a young man growing up watching the violence around his neighborhood. The number of writers in the entire history of rap who can do that on demand can probably fit at one dinner table, and one of them is the man from Compton. Not one of the ones who could, one of the ones who does.
And it keeps going. Kendrick Lamar lands another one. If I can give him the game to hydroplane his decisions in life so he can go further than the streets. Hydroplane his decisions. That single image, a young man's choices skating across the surface of a wet street, momentum so high the wheels barely touch the ground, is a metaphor that operates on 3 levels at once. There is the literal vehicular image. There is the danger of losing control implication. And there is the elevated momentum implication. 1 verb, 3 meanings. That is the kind of writing that gets graduate students assigned to write papers about it. And he tossed it off inside a verse on a radio freestyle. Now, before the comments section catches fire, let us be honest about something Drake defenders deserve to hear, because we are not running a hit piece, we are running a craft analysis. Drake is not a bad writer. He has written hits. He has written choruses that have lived rent-free in the global consciousness for 15 years straight. His pen for melody, for mood, for the catchphrase as a bar is genuinely a gift. I could kick a punt and turn it into a field goal. That is a clean punchline. If they're a sight to see, then I am an illusion. That is a thoughtful, well-constructed bar. He can write. Nobody serious is saying he cannot write. But the question on the table is not whether he can write. The question is whether Drake can outright Kendrick Lamar at the level of pure literary craft. And on that very specific scoreboard, measurable, objective, the same scoreboard you would use to judge any poet alive, the answer keeps coming back the same way it came back when the Pulitzer committee made it official. Honestly, you can already tell where this is going if you have ever sat with both catalogs for more than a weekend. But here's where it gets interesting, because the conversation around the Pulitzer is itself a trap. Drake fans will tell you the Pulitzer does not predict hip-hop. And that's technically true. The Pulitzer is not a hip-hop barometer. But the Pulitzer is absolutely a writing barometer. And Kendrick Lamar is the only rapper alive who has been measured on that scale and cleared it. The Pulitzer board does not give out trophies for streams. They don't give them out for charisma. They don't give them out for being on the radio. They give them out for the written work, full stop. And Kendrick Lamar's written work was deemed strong enough to sit beside the country's most decorated literary architects. That's not a small thing. That is the system itself acknowledging the page. And the wildest part about it is that Kendrick Lamar earned that recognition off Damn, an album that, on the surface, plays as a relatively accessible major label record. The committee did not give the prize to Pimp a Butterfly, which is the album most critics expected to be canonized. They gave it to the album where Kendrick Lamar was already operating in compression mode. Think about what that means. The Pulitzer committee was so floored by what Kendrick Lamar was doing in his easier mode that they couldn't let it pass. And Drake fans want to dismiss that with a wave? Predictably, of course they do, because dismissing the Pulitzer is the only way to keep the debate technically open. And before we keep moving, hit that like button if this is the kind of breakdown you wish more channels would actually do. Because the temptation in this space is always to take the easy lane, run the streams versus streams take and call it a day.
But that's exactly the lane that has rotted the conversation around hip-hop for the last decade. The craft deserves better than that. Drake deserves better than that. Kendrick Lamar deserves better than that. And you, sitting here, deserve better than that. When you stack the whole thing up, the two freestyles side by side, page on page, breath for breath, syllable for syllable, three things become impossible to ignore. The first is rhyme complexity. Drake operates predominantly in single-syllable end rhyme. Kendrick Lamar operates predominantly in multi-syllabic, internal, and chain rhyme schemes that often stretch entire lines into rhyming units. That's not a stylistic difference, that's a technical gap. The second is literary toolbox usage. Across 2 minutes of a cappella Kendrick Lamar verse, you can pull alliteration, assonance, consonants, metaphor, simile, double entendre, alliterative chains, narrative storytelling, characterization, and dialogue insertion. Across the same 2 minutes of a cappella Drake, you can pull strong conversational tone, melodic awareness, and a small handful of punchlines. Both are valid writers. Only one is operating across the full toolbox. The third is delivery integration, and this matters more than most people admit. Kendrick Lamar's verses are written in such a way that the cadence, the breath, the syllabic stress, and the emotional weight are pre-built into the page. Drake's verses, in freestyle form, audibly pieced together. There are seam lines between verses where he's clearly stitching written sections together on the fly. That's not a slander. Almost every rapper does it. But the cleanliness of the seams is a writing question, and Kendrick Lamar's seams are invisible.
Let us zoom in on that third point one more time, because it really is the underrated piece of the whole conversation. When he spits the Tim Westwood freestyle, you can actually hear him patching the right above it verse onto something else mid-flow. Listen for the breath he takes before he switches gears. That breath is not a stylistic choice. That breath is a writer running out of pre-prepared material and reaching for the next folder. And there is no shame in it. Every rapper from Jay-Z to Andre 3000 has been caught doing it on a radio show somewhere. But when you put that same breath next to the domino-table verse from Kendrick Lamar, where every line builds on the previous one without a single audible seam, the gap is the gap. His verse is one piece of writing. The other is two pieces of writing being held together with tape on live radio. Drake's defenders, predictably, will now reach for the ghostwriting conversation, and they will say, "You do not even know what Drake actually writes." And they are not wrong to raise it. The ghostwriting allegations around Drake are real, they are documented, and they are part of the public record at this point. But here is the thing about the freestyle comparison we just walked through. We used material that, by all available accounts, he himself wrote. The Tim Westwood freestyle and the right above it verse are both attributed to Drake's own pen. So this is not a smear. This is the cleanest, fairest possible comparison, and it still lands the way it lands. That should tell you something. Predictably, you will also hear the freestyle does not mean off-the-top argument, and that is also fair. Modern radio freestyles are almost never freestyles in the purest sense. They are written verses delivered in a freestyle format, which actually strengthens the case, because the verses we just compared are both prepared writing. Both rappers had time to revise. Both rappers had time to choose their best version, and what we heard in their best chosen version is the gap. Naturally, the gap does not erase him. It does not erase his catalog. It does not erase his commercial dominance. It does not erase his contribution to the global popularity of the genre. But on the writing question, the question on the table tonight, the gap is the gap. Some of you are going to push back and say, what about his storytelling on songs like Marvin's Room or Look What You've Done? And that is a fair pivot, because Drake actually does excel at a specific kind of storytelling. Confessional, intimate, present tense, drunk dial energy. That is a real skill, and he has it dialed all the way in. But notice the kind of story he tells in those songs. It is almost always a story about himself in the immediate moment in the present tense first person. Now, compare that to Kendrick Lamar's storytelling on Sing About Me, I'm Dying of Thirst, where Kendrick Lamar adopts 3 different first-person perspectives across one song. One, a dying gangbanger, one, the brother of a murdered prostitute, and one, Kendrick Lamar himself, and ties all 3 into a single thematic arc about death and redemption. That is a fundamentally different level of writerly architecture. One writes the room he's in, the other writes the room, the building, the block, and the entire economic system that put the building on the block. There's one more layer here that almost nobody is talking about, and it is the cultural piece, because the writing question is also a values question. Kendrick Lamar writes from a place that is rooted in his community, in the streets of Compton, in the kitchen table conversations between his father and his uncle, in the specific texture of growing up around addiction, around violence, around the church and the corner store sitting on the same block. That rootedness shows up in the craft. It's why his metaphors feel inevitable instead of decorative. It's why his alliteration carries weight instead of just sound. His counterpart, by his own admission, writes from a different position, from the position of a global pop cultural observer, from the position of someone who has been famous for half his life, from the position of a writer whose subject is increasingly the conditions of his own fame. Neither position is wrong. Both are valid, but the rooted writer almost always wins the writing question, because rooted writing produces specificity, and specificity is the bedrock of literary craft.
And with all of that on the table, the question becomes, why is this debate even still happening? Why are platforms full of self-appointed experts still pretending that this question is open? Why are entire podcast networks dedicating panels and roundtables and split screens to a comparison that, if you actually do the technical reading, was settled a long time ago? The answer is engagement. The answer is the algorithm. The answer is that Kendrick is the better writer is a 5-second take that does not sustain a 20-minute show. But who is the better writer, you decide, sustains an entire content cycle. And so the conversation gets manufactured into permanent ambiguity because permanent ambiguity is what monetizes. The writing itself does not need the debate. The platforms do. And here is where it really gets interesting, because the audience is starting to catch on. You can see it in the comment sections. You can see it in the way Kendrick Lamar's recent catalog has been consumed, slowly, repeatedly, line by line, with people pulling out the literary devices and posting them like trading cards. You can see it in the way GNX, Not Like Us, Meet the Grams, and even older cuts like Sing About Me, I'm Dying of Thirst keep generating new analytical content years after release. That is not a coincidence. That is what writing of literary depth does. It rewards re-listening because there are more layers each time you re-enter the verse. The other catalog, by contrast, generates its longevity through mood and melody, which is a different gift, equally valid, but a different gift. You do not go back to those songs to re-decode the literary structure. You go back to them to feel a feeling. And here is the part that nobody wants to say out loud, even though it has been sitting in plain sight the entire time. The reason Kendrick Lamar has the cleaner writing scoreboard is because Kendrick Lamar has openly treated rap as literature for his entire career. Kendrick Lamar reads. Kendrick Lamar studies poetry. Kendrick Lamar studies the cadence of preachers, the cadence of street storytellers, the cadence of jazz horn players. Kendrick Lamar writes inside that lineage. Drake, again by his own admission across multiple interviews, treats rap as a commercial vehicle inside a broader entertainment portfolio. Both choices are legitimate, but one of those choices produces literary writing and the other produces commercial writing. And on the writing scoreboard, the literary writer wins by structural inevitability. Tell me where you land on this, honestly. Drop a comment with your verdict, and not just the verdict, but the bar that convinced you, because the bar is the receipt. If you are in the Drake camp, give us a bar from him that outrights vivid images going against any fantasy you can fathom. Phantoms ain't the only thing that's suicidal. If you can find one, post it, because that is the conversation that pushes everybody forward. I promise you, every single comment with a real bar attached is going to get pinned for the next 48 hours, because that is the kind of energy this conversation actually needs. And no matter how you spin the framing of all this, the bigger truth underneath is one we should all sit with. Kendrick Lamar and Drake are not opponents in some cosmic sense. They are two different writers operating in two different lanes with two different toolboxes serving two different functions in the culture. Drake is the writer of the moment. Kendrick Lamar is the writer of the record. Drake writes for the speaker in the car. Kendrick Lamar writes for the textbook in the classroom 30 years from now. Both have value, but when you isolate the page, when you mute the production, when you strip away everything that is not the bare written work, Kendrick Lamar is operating on a tier that very few writers in the history of the genre have ever reached. That is not slander against Drake. That is a celebration of a craft that, in a culture obsessed with surface, still occasionally produces a writer who treats the page like it is sacred. There is one final point worth making before we wrap, and it is the one that keeps me up at night about the state of this whole conversation. The reason so many people are confused about who the better writer is between Kendrick Lamar and Drake is not because the question is genuinely confusing. It is because the writing literacy of the average listener has dropped through the floor over the last 15 years. We have a generation of listeners who have been trained by the algorithm to value hooks over verses, choruses over storytelling, repetition over revelation. And when you grow up on that diet, of course it sounds like Drake and Kendrick Lamar are operating on the same plane, because the parts of writing you've been taught to value, the catchy hook, the snappy line, the quotable phrase, Drake genuinely does dominate. But the moment you start training your ear to hear rhyme architecture, internal structure, narrative compression, and literary device stacking, the conversation resettles in seconds. Kendrick Lamar runs away with it. And once your ear gets there, you can't unhear it. And if you've made it this far in the video, you already know what time it is. Hit the like, hit the subscribe, drop your verdict in the comments, and pin the bar that you think settles it for you. We're going to keep doing the work that the platforms refuse to do. The actual craft breakdowns, the actual literary readings, the actual receipts. Because the more honest the conversation gets, the better the music gets, naturally. And while we're at it, if you want to see the deep dive that broke down exactly how Kendrick Lamar quietly built the entire PG Lang machine into the most important independent operation in modern music, check out the suggested video next. You're not going to want to miss it. You're the best, and we'll see you in the next one.